She wasn't walking into that studio to play their game. They invited a headline. But what they got was a reckoning. They thought they were summoning a storm. What they didn't know was, the storm had already arrived and it was sitting in the dressing room, silent, composed, and deadly calm. Backstage was colder than expected, and not just because of the air conditioning. There was a tension in the air that didn't belong to technical rehearsals or camera checks. It was the kind of cold that came from eyes that scanned without welcoming, from smiles that stopped at the lips and never reached the eyes. Jasmine Crockett sat beneath the glow of dressing room lights that should have made her feel like a guest, but instead felt like searchlights on a prisoner. The mirror in front of her reflected more than her makeup. It reflected a room full of people pretending not to stare, pretending they didn't already have a story to tell about her before she even opened her mouth. There were no warm greetings, no curious questions about her work in Congress, only silence and an invisible script everyone seemed to be holding except her. A young production assistant passed by without stopping, murmuring just loud enough for someone to hear. "They're expecting fireworks. She's going to play the angry black woman card." It wasn't said with malice, it was worse. It was said with boredom, as if it were obvious, routine, as if she were just the next black woman in a long line to be framed, provoked, and packaged for morning television drama. Jasmine heard every word. She didn't flinch, didn't turn. She let it settle, let it breathe. And then, without raising her voice, she spoke, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough that the entire room felt it in their bones. "If they brought me here expecting a performance," she said slowly, deliberately, "they're going to be shocked when the truth doesn't follow the script." Her tone was calm, almost gentle, but underneath it was iron, years of being underestimated, misjudged, boxed in, and then told to smile for the cameras. She smiled now, but it was different. Not the kind of smile you wear to please. The kind you wear when you know exactly who you are, and you're done asking for permission to be it. Whoopi Goldberg sat at the center of the semicircle like she had 100 times before. Posture composed, face unreadable, tone soft but heavy with experience. The queen of daytime confrontation, the one who didn't need to shout to land a blow. Jasmine Crockett sat across from her, spine straight, expression calm, but her senses were sharp. Everything about the studio felt artificial, the lighting too perfect, the air too still, the smiles just a little too measured. They were mid-discussion, the kind of scripted warm-up where nothing too controversial gets said and nothing too real gets heard. Jasmine answered questions about her path into politics, how she balanced the demands of office, even cracked a light joke about sleepless nights. The audience chuckled. It all felt smooth, almost too smooth, the way a hallway does before a trap door opens. Jasmine had been in enough rooms to know when something was coming. And it was. The energy shifted, not with words, but with rhythm. Whoopi's gaze changed. She no longer looked at Jasmine as a guest, but as a target. The conversation slowed. The co-hosts fell quieter. There was a beat, a half-second of silence that wasn't on the cue card. And then Whoopi leaned in, the way a prosecutor leans in before delivering a question designed not to clarify, but to corner. Her voice remained soft, steady, wrapped in practiced concern. "You're a lawyer," she began, her tone gentle, almost complimentary. "A congresswoman, a woman of color." She let each phrase land like a polished stone on the table, a setup dressed like respect. Her eyes stayed locked, her smile thin. Then came the shift, the blade hidden behind the velvet. "But do you ever think," she asked slowly, "maybe you're building a brand more than building real policy? That maybe you're using your identity more than your ideas?" The question fell into the room like a stone into still water, quiet, heavy, intentional. And the ripples were immediate, not in sound, but in silence. The kind of silence that made producers lean forward in their chairs and camera operators hold focus an extra beat. The kind of silence that, if you listened closely, sounded like someone daring her to prove she belonged at that table in the first place. The applause came fast, loud, and almost mechanical, like muscle memory. Audience members clapped not just out of agreement, but out of expectation. This was The View, after all. They'd seen this play out before. A pointed question from Whoopi, a conservative or outsider fumbles, a few sound bites later, the moment goes viral. It was familiar, and they thought this would be no different. They believed the line had landed, that Jasmine had just been pinned to the wall by a question too sharp, too loaded, too public to escape. It wasn't just a question, it was the accusation behind it, that her identity wasn't earned but curated, that her power wasn't the result of grit and law and sleepless nights, but of marketing. They thought Whoopi had cornered her, and they were already applauding the takedown, but Jasmine didn't blink. She sat perfectly still, hands resting lightly on the table, her breathing steady. Not a single twitch of discomfort or anger in her face, not even a flicker. Where they expected offense, she offered silence. Where they expected fire, she offered stillness. And as the applause rolled over her like a wave she had already outgrown, she didn't rush to speak. She waited, letting the room burn off its adrenaline, letting the crowd reveal itself, not as an audience, but as a mirror. She had seen this performance before, just not always under studio lights. The moment when people cheer not for truth, but for confirmation. The moment when they reward the question that cuts, not the courage it takes to answer. It was an old rhythm, and she had outlived it. Then slowly, deliberately, she turned her head toward the camera. Not toward Whoopi, not toward the co-hosts, not toward the crowd. Straight into the lens, into the homes of millions watching from couches and break rooms and hospital beds, into the eyes of anyone who had ever been told their identity was a brand, their pain was a prop, or their existence was only allowed if it came with a smile. Her expression didn't change, her voice didn't rise. But what she said next hit with the force of a truth no one could clap away. "I don't carry my blackness as a weapon," she said, her tone calm but unshakably firm. "I carry it as a record of survival." The words didn't shout. They didn't need to. They sank, slowly, like something ancient and heavy, into the air and settled over the room like dust no one could brush off. They didn't demand a reaction. They stopped it cold. The applause died instantly, as if someone had cut the feed. The audience froze, not in disagreement, but in sudden, uncomfortable clarity. What she had said wasn't part of the narrative they came to see. It wasn't the angry outburst. It wasn't the defensive retreat. It was something far more dangerous. It was undeniable. In one sentence, she had stripped the room of its theater. She had taken a question designed to box her in and turned it into a statement too big to contain. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't polished for sound bites. It was raw, personal, true. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric. The kind of silence that comes when everyone realizes all at once that they've just heard something they can't unhear. That something in the room has shifted, and it's not going back. And no one, not even Whoopi, spoke next. The silence that followed Jasmine's words wasn't just still, it was sacred. Not a performance pause, not dead air. It was the kind of silence that happens in a courtroom when the verdict hits, or in a battlefield just before the smoke clears. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice, but somehow the room felt smaller now, tighter. She had thrown off the script, and everyone knew it. Even the applause sign in the studio seemed to flicker awkwardly, unsure whether it still had power. The audience looked toward Whoopi, waiting for her to bring the control back, to reframe the moment, to cut through the truth Jasmine had just dropped with something snappy, dismissive, familiar. But when Whoopi leaned forward again, it wasn't with ease. It was with edge. Her tone no longer wrapped in velvet. Her rhythm quickened. The gloves quietly had come off. "So you keep talking about discrimination?" Whoopi snapped, her voice harder now, stripped of diplomacy. "You say these things on every stage you get, but what are you doing to actually unite people? To build anything?" She didn't blink. "Because if all you offer is more division, how does that help the people you say you're fighting for?" It wasn't a question, it was a dare, delivered not just to challenge Jasmine's ideas, but to corner her character, as if to say, pain is real, but stop talking about it. Justice matters, but not if it makes others uncomfortable. And if your truth doesn't come with unity tied in a bow, we don't want it. The crowd shifted again, tension rising. Not because Whoopi was right, but because she had drawn a line in the sand. And once again, all eyes turned to Jasmine, waiting to see if she would cross it. The question still lingered in the air like smoke. What does all this talk about discrimination actually do for the people? Jasmine didn't rush to respond. She didn't counterpunch. Instead, she took a slow breath, the kind you take when you know you're about to open a wound. Not yours, but one you've carried for someone else. Her tone shifted. No longer defensive, no longer rhetorical, just human. "Let me tell you a true story," she said, her voice steady but low. "A boy named Darnell, 14 years old, arrested in Dallas County for standing outside a gas station where something happened 10 minutes earlier. Wrong place, wrong time. No weapon, no stolen goods, no evidence. Just a black kid wearing a hoodie with no one to speak for him." She paused, not for drama, but for weight, the kind of pause that forced the room to hold its breath. They charged him with aggravated robbery. He kept saying he didn't do it, but it didn't matter. The court set his bail at $1,200. That's it, $1,200, not $10,000, not $1 million. Just enough to keep him locked up if his family couldn't find it. She looked around the studio now, not at the hosts, but at the audience, at the cameras, at the millions who would watch and maybe forget. And they couldn't. His mother worked 2 jobs, fast food and cleaning houses. His father was already gone. They tried, they begged, they called everyone they could think of, but the money never came. Her voice grew quieter, but somehow more powerful. So he sat in detention. Not for a few nights, not even a few weeks. 2 years. A child, 14, locked up for over 700 days without trial, without a conviction, because the law decided that poverty looked like guilt. Because in our system, innocence has a price tag, and he couldn't pay it. The silence in the room wasn't polite. It was heavy, a kind of shame that settled over the set like dust. No applause sign flashed. No one dared move. Then Jasmine leaned in just slightly and added, "So you ask me what talking about discrimination does? It reminds people that Darnell existed, that he mattered, that injustice isn't just a debate topic. It's a boy who missed his entire 9th grade year in a cell that smelled like bleach and concrete. And it's people like me who refuse to stop saying his name, who keep this country from pretending it never happened." And for a moment, even the cameras seemed afraid to blink. The air still hadn't moved since Jasmine finished Darnell's story. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just hold a room, it haunts it. No music, no cue, no words. Even the audience, trained over hundreds of episodes to laugh, clap, react on command, now sat unsure of themselves, as if reality had broken through the layers of television polish. Jasmine could feel it, the itch to pivot, to soften, to turn away from the truth she just laid bare. But she didn't give them that escape. She didn't reach for comfort. She didn't offer slogans or shift the topic to safer ground. Instead, she leaned in just slightly, her voice low but crystal clear, and asked not Whoopi, not the co-hosts, but the entire room, and beyond it, the nation watching live. If unity means silence in the face of injustice, then I choose to stand alone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The words hit harder because they were calm, unapologetic, certain, and suddenly everything in the room felt off balance. The lights too bright, the silence too thick. A few people in the audience began to clap, softly, uncertainly, like their hands were moving before their minds had caught up. Others looked around, unsure whether they were supposed to. This wasn't the response they were used to. This wasn't a punchline or a takedown or a scripted beat. It was raw truth, unfiltered, uncut, and most of all, inconvenient. The applause, if you could call it that, never gathered momentum. It stuttered, scattered. A few claps here, a few nods there, but nothing cohesive, nothing television-worthy. And that made it all the more powerful, because what Jasmine had done wasn't designed for applause. It wasn't meant to entertain. She had drawn a line in the sand, not for drama, but for conscience. And in doing so, she'd shifted the entire temperature of the room. What had begun as a performance was now something else entirely. Unpredictable, unrehearsed, real. Whoopi's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation. Across the table, her co-hosts exchanged quiet, unsettled glances. Even the stage manager, usually so precise, so composed, hesitated with his cue cards, unsure if he was supposed to move forward or freeze, because this moment didn't fit the format. Jasmine Crockett hadn't followed the arc they were counting on. She wasn't playing the role of the outraged guest or the emotional politician. She was doing something far more dangerous. She was telling the truth and daring them to sit with it. The air in the studio had turned brittle, like glass waiting to crack. Jasmine's previous words still echoed in the silence, and for the first time, the momentum of the show was no longer in the hands of its veteran host. Whoopi Goldberg sat up straighter, her expression tightening. She'd lost the room once already, and she wasn't going to let it slip again. This wasn't just another guest with a message. This was someone reshaping the script in real time, and that was dangerous. So Whoopi struck harder, her voice now stripped of warmth, wrapped instead in the kind of sarcasm that cuts deep when spoken by someone with power. "And what exactly do you think you represent?" she asked, words sharp like broken glass. "You've been in Congress, what, a year?" She leaned forward, eyebrows raised. "This isn't Twitter. This is the real world." Laughter stirred faintly from the crowd, nervous, unsure, the kind that waits for permission to erupt but never quite gets it. The message was clear. Jasmine was young, untested, too loud, too bold, too early in her career to speak with so much authority. It wasn't just a challenge, it was a dismissal, a warning. Stay in your lane. Let the grown-ups talk. The blow wasn't about her policies, it was about her presence. The subtle suggestion that she was more performance than substance, more noise than knowledge, that her convictions were hashtags, not history, that her voice didn't belong in a room built by others. But Jasmine didn't look away. She didn't raise her voice or snap back. Her silence was not surrender. It was control. And when she did speak, it wasn't fast or defensive. It was slow, steady, like truth walking up the stairs while lies took the elevator. "I don't represent Twitter," she said, eyes steady, voice calm but sharp as steel. "I represent the mother who had her door kicked in at 5 in the morning while her kids were still asleep. I represent the woman who lost her home before the sun came up, while the morning news ran stories about celebrity divorces and pumpkin spice season, but never once mentioned her name. She let that hang there, not as a punchline, as a reality that rarely made it to daytime TV, a reality that didn't trend, but tore lives apart, a reality that too many people only acknowledged in private, behind closed doors, never under studio lights. And in that moment, Jasmine wasn't just answering Whoopi, she was rejecting the idea that visibility had to come with permission. She wasn't defending her time in Congress. She was defending the millions who never got 5 minutes in a room like this, and never would. The weight of Jasmine's words still hung thick in the air, like smoke refusing to clear. Her voice hadn't risen, but the atmosphere had. She had disarmed Whoopi's attack not with anger, but with something far more dangerous, truth spoken plainly. The audience sat motionless. Even the cameras seemed slower now, unsure whether they were still recording a talk show or a reckoning. Then, like someone yanking a fire alarm to break the tension, a co-host jumped in. Her voice was brighter, sharper, the tone of someone trying to reassert control, not just of the conversation, but of the narrative itself. "That's a powerful story," she said, smile tight, eyes narrowed. "But in reality, what have you actually done? I mean, stories are one thing, but have you even passed a single law?" The question sliced through the moment like cold steel. It wasn't curiosity. It was a rescue mission, an attempt to drag the show back onto its rails by framing Jasmine's conviction as empty rhetoric, as if impact could only be measured in bills passed through a broken Congress, as if the bar for worthiness was legislative math, not moral clarity. The implication was brutal but familiar. You talk a good game, but where are your wins? What have you actually changed? And just like that, the room braced itself again. All eyes turned to Jasmine, not to see if she had an answer, but to see if she'd crack under the pressure of being held to a standard that people like her were rarely allowed to set. The co-host's question still lingered in the air like a trap that had just been triggered. Have you even passed a single law? It was the kind of question that looked harmless on the surface, reasonable even, but everyone in the room could feel it land like a slap. Not because of what was asked, but how. The phrasing was surgical, measured. It didn't deny Jasmine's lived experience. It didn't argue her values. It did something quieter and colder. It diminished them. It reduced everything she'd said, the truths she laid bare, the voices she carried, into a scoreboard. Numbers, passed or failed, win or lose. As if the only thing that proved her value was how many bills bore her name. As if impact could only be validated by signatures and ink. As if the machinery of a deeply partisan, often paralyzed Congress could ever reflect the real worth of someone fighting for those who have no lobbyist. A few audience members shifted in their seats, unsure. Some nodded, some frowned. Others looked to Jasmine, waiting for the moment where maybe she'd finally stumble. Maybe this would be it, the line she couldn't cross, the proof she hadn't done enough. But Jasmine didn't look shaken. She didn't reach for talking points. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, with the same quiet determination she carried into every hearing room and late-night drafting session, she reached down beside her chair and pulled out a thick folder. Worn, bent, real. The kind of folder that had seen fluorescent committee lighting, been passed from staffer to staffer, and sat in unopened inboxes for months. She placed it gently on the table in front of her, letting the weight of it thud against the polished wood like a soft gavel. She opened it without theatrics. No grand reveal, no drama, just facts. Neatly tabbed and labeled. 17 separate legislative proposals, each one carefully structured, rooted in data, reviewed by teams of lawyers and policy staff. Bills she had written, sponsored, fought for, brought to the floor, or tried to. But none of them had passed. Not because they weren't viable, but because they were never given oxygen. Blocked in committee, buried in procedure. Killed by the slow, quiet violence of indifference. Housing equity for displaced families. Maternal health protections for Black mothers dying at 3 times the national rate. Bail reform for kids like Darnell. Environmental cleanup in rural towns where toxins outlive jobs. Accountability measures for local law enforcement. School funding, realignment. Clean water mandates for poison zip codes no one could find on a postcard. 17 times she had tried. 17 times the machinery had closed its ears. Jasmine didn't look angry. She looked tired and unshakably honest. She gestured toward the open folder with one hand, not for the cameras, but for the truth. And when she finally spoke, it was not defensive. It was steady, quiet, measured, like a final statement in a courtroom before the verdict. I'm not lacking in effort, she said, looking straight ahead, not just at the co-host, but beyond her, into the audience, into the camera, into every voter who had ever been told they were asking for too much. Congress is just lacking ears to listen. There was no applause, no sudden gasp, just stillness. The kind of stillness that follows when someone says something so true, so plain, that there's nowhere left to hide behind the usual noise. Even the co-host, polished and poised, didn't move. She sat motionless, blinking once, then twice, as if realizing the questions she'd asked had just been turned into a mirror. Because Jasmine hadn't just answered the question, she had exposed the questioner. And beyond that, the broken system that asked survivors to prove their pain in policy briefs, that asked fighters to show receipts before it will hear their voices. In that moment, she wasn't pleading for respect. She was pointing to the proof and daring anyone to look away. The folder sat open, untouched, its contents now part of the air, thick, undeniable, and heavy. Jasmine's words still hung like a blade suspended mid-swing. Congress is just lacking ears to listen. It wasn't the volume of her voice that shook the studio. It was the finality in it, the way she didn't beg to be heard. She simply stated that she had spoken. The burden of listening now belonged to everyone else. Across the table, Whoopi Goldberg, usually sharp, quick, invincible, froze. Her pen, once casually flipping between her fingers, fell still. She glanced toward the producer's corner, then toward her cue card, as if searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. The reflex to push back was there, but it hit a wall of truth that could not be spun into daytime rhythm. Her brow furrowed, not with rage but with recognition. Something had shifted. This wasn't just an exchange anymore. It was exposure. Next to her, the co-host who had fired the last question looked down, eyes fixed on the paper in front of her. She wasn't reading. She was retreating. The very script that had been designed to steer the conversation was now an anchor dragging against the weight of Jasmine's presence. Even her carefully practiced half-smile, polished from years on air, was gone. What replaced it was the expression of someone who realized, too late, that the rules of engagement had been rewritten mid-show. And then came the camera sweep, slow, methodical, almost cautious. The lens moved across the front row of the audience like a spotlight, unsure whether it should reveal or protect. The usual expressions, eager claps, smirks, whispered affirmations, were absent. Instead, still faces, hands clasped, shoulders stiff, eyes locked. Some viewers leaned forward slightly, not out of excitement, but tension. Others leaned back, brows knit, as if reevaluating what they thought they came to see. A few older men, silent until now, nodded slowly. Not in agreement with an argument, but in recognition of something truer than talking points. Something that reached beneath politics and touched something older, heavier, unshakable. And in that exact moment, when the air was thick enough to carve, when every mouth had gone dry, when even the studio lights seemed to dim just a little, Jasmine turned. She didn't turn toward Whoopi. She didn't look to the hosts. She turned straight to the camera. The lens found her, and she let it. No blinking, no pause. She stared down the barrel of that machine, knowing full well it was designed to control, to frame, to edit, to cut. But she refused to let it do any of those things. And then she said it, not in a roar, not with a flourish. She spoke it like a fact carved in stone. The truth cannot be silenced, no matter how many cameras you set or how many laughs you script. It wasn't a line for applause. It wasn't a viral mic drop. It was a warning to every executive in the control booth, a warning to every producer who thought they could package pain for ratings, a warning to every host who believed timing and tone were stronger than lived truth. And it was a vow that no matter how much they tried to twist the story, drown it in laughter, or cut it in post, they would not own the truth she had just spoken. Not today, not ever. The moment the studio lights dimmed, it was as if someone had lifted the lid off a pressure cooker. The audience dispersed, the hosts retreated behind their makeup mirrors, and producers tried to pretend everything had gone according to plan. But they all knew better. Something had broken, not in the set, not in the show, in the narrative. The show had ended, but the reckoning had just begun. At first, there was only silence, then a ripple. The clip didn't need editing. It didn't need music or overlays. Someone, likely a viewer watching from their kitchen table with a phone in hand and toast growing cold, had captured the moment Jasmine Crockett locked eyes with the camera and said, "The truth cannot be silenced, no matter how many cameras you set or how many laughs you script." The clip hit X, formerly Twitter, like a match in dry brush. Thousands watched, then tens of thousands, then millions. It wasn't just trending, it was erupting. People didn't share the video because they loved politics. They shared it because something in Jasmine's delivery bypassed their political fatigue. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't flinched, she hadn't begged to be believed. She had told the truth and dared the world to deny it. By noon, conservative talk shows were dissecting her every syllable, not to mock her, but to figure out how she had done what few had managed. She'd taken the high ground and set it on fire. One right-leaning host admitted, almost grudgingly, "I don't agree with a word of her policy, but damn it, she owned that room." Another commentator from a libertarian channel wrote simply, "Finally, someone who talks like she's not auditioning for power." On the other side, some liberal commentators fumbled. Jasmine didn't fit their mold. She was a Democrat, but she didn't play safe. She was a black woman, but she didn't allow herself to be categorized, softened, or controlled. Some pundits praised her courage. Others accused her of being divisive, the oldest trick in the book, and the laziest. But the public wasn't listening to the pundits anymore. They were watching her. And most surprising of all, the ones watching closest weren't the usual progressive audience. They were men, working class, middle-aged, disillusioned, the kind who rarely watched The View and never trusted its format. Truckers eating lunch in their cabs, vets flipping through channels in Virginia waiting rooms, factory workers on break scrolling through their phones, farmers whose radios played conservative talk all day. They weren't quoting legislation. They weren't debating platforms. They were asking a simple question, one after another, in forums, group chats, barbershops. Who is she? Not what party is she in? Not what's her voting record? Just, who is this woman who walked into a studio stacked against her and refused to bow her head? The answer for them wasn't about politics. It was about posture, about presence, about a kind of strength that didn't need to yell to be heard. One Vietnam vet from Montana wrote on a Facebook post that had been shared over 80,000 times. "I don't care who she voted for. I care that she looked the machine in the eye and didn't blink." Another, a retired steelworker from Pittsburgh, commented under a news clip, "Haven't trusted a politician in 20 years. Don't know if I trust her yet, but I believe she believes what she's saying." That's a start. The mainstream press, desperate to keep pace, scrambled to catch the narrative. Some morning shows replayed the clip but added their own spin, softening the edges, layering it with commentary, trying to wrap Jasmine's conviction in digestible packaging. It didn't work. People weren't watching for analysis. They were watching for clarity, and she had given them that without needing anyone's permission. Cable news anchors tried to frame it as a political moment, but they missed the deeper truth. This wasn't about parties. This was about presence, about seeing someone on screen who didn't crumble under pressure, about seeing someone finally say what so many people had screamed into the dark for decades, that the system doesn't fail because we don't care. It fails because it never listens. That idea stuck. The algorithms noticed. Jasmine's face was everywhere. TikTok edits paired her voice with slow-motion overlays and swelling orchestral music. YouTube thumbnails showed her pointing calmly across the table, surrounded by stunned co-hosts. Reddit threads exploded with speculation. Would she run for Senate? Could she lead a movement? Was she the next face of generational truth-telling in a landscape addicted to image? But more quietly, and more powerfully, something else began. Conversations, real ones, in diners, in union halls, in online message boards that weren't meant for politics but suddenly couldn't ignore it. Men who had voted for Reagan, then Clinton, then Trump, found themselves watching that clip again. Not for what Jasmine said, but for how she said it. Calm, director, without apology. "She's not the usual type," one retired postal worker wrote on a military forum, "and maybe that's why she's dangerous to them." A bartender in Arkansas shared the clip with the caption, "My dad doesn't talk politics. Last night he asked me to look this woman up. That's never happened before." And the phrase began to form, quietly, repeated across state lines, whispered over backyard grills, typed in private text threads between men who didn't talk about politics because they didn't trust anyone in it. Maybe she's the only one who can face the whole damn system and not lose her calm. Not because she insulted the opposition, not because she won a debate, but because when the system tried to frame her, contain her, define her, she refused, and did it without breaking eye contact. What Jasmine did that day wasn't just clap back. She didn't play the media's game. She played her own. She rewrote the emotional rules of a platform designed to either uplift or destroy. And in doing so, she reached a part of the American psyche that had long grown numb. She reminded people what courage looked like when it didn't wear a cape. She reminded people that stillness, true, unmoved, unbought stillness, could be more powerful than a soundbite. And she did it while the cameras rolled, while the producers panicked, while the narrative tried to reshape itself in real time. No one quite knew what would happen next, But in that breathless aftermath, across living rooms and long-haul routes and faded union halls, something undeniable stirred. Not a revolution, not yet, but recognition. Recognition that in a political landscape littered with theatrics and sellouts, someone had walked into the lion's den, looked power in the face and said, "I see you, but you don't scare me." And that for the first time in a long time made people believe that maybe, just maybe, truth was still possible on live television. The clip was still looping when the fifth person entered the room, clutching a folder that no one opened. On the screen, Jasmine Crockett stared into the lens with unnerving steadiness as her voice played back, flat and fierce. The truth cannot be silenced, no matter how many cameras you set or how many laughs you script. No one spoke. No one dared. It was the fourth time they'd watched that exact 30-second segment. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and nervous deodorant. The usual buzz of post-production chatter was gone, replaced by an invisible fog of disbelief and tightening throats. These were professionals, most of them with 2 decades of television under their belts. They had survived wardrobe malfunctions, on-air protests, even lawsuits from sitting senators. But this was different. "This wasn't the show," said Diane Renner, VP of Segment Strategy. She stood with her arms crossed, her knuckles pale against the cuffs of her gray blazer. "This wasn't the guest we booked." Across the table, Dan Hollister, executive producer of The View for the past 7 years, leaned forward with elbows on the oak grain. "She didn't go off script," he said, his voice low, almost numb. "She rewrote the script." A chuckle escaped from someone in the back. Nervous, awkward. No one acknowledged it. The president of daytime programming, Conrad Ellis, exhaled sharply through his nose. "The hell's that supposed to mean?" Dan didn't look up. "We built a machine, a rhythm. Conservative guests come in, they argue, they defend, they get rattled, the panel pushes back, audience claps, viral moment, done. It's performance. Predictable. She didn't play her part." Conrad slammed a hand lightly against the table. Not angry yet, but frustrated by the language. "So what? She was boring." "No," Dan said, finally looking up. "She was undeniable." The word hung in the air like a bell tone that wouldn't stop ringing. At the far end of the table, Olivia Chen, social engagement director, flipped her iPad around for everyone to see. "We're at 12.4 million views across TikTok, X, and YouTube Shorts in under 10 hours. Comments are 78% positive. That's unheard of." "Positive?" Diane frowned. "From who?" Olivia swiped. "Veterans groups, independents, blue-collar pages in Ohio, Missouri, Kansas." Also trending in Canada for some reason, someone called her the steel spine of Texas. Conrad rubbed his temples. "Christ." "What's the real issue here?" asked Brad Jansen, a legal rep from Standards and Practices, his voice oozing with calm control. "That she did too well? That people liked it? That they listened," Diane snapped. Everyone turned to her. "She cracked something open," she said, pacing slightly now. "She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult anyone. She never lost control. And somehow it made our people look like they did. That clip doesn't look like a debate. It looks like an intervention." Silence returned. A junior producer in the corner, Max, barely 30, cleared his throat. "We thought we invited the viral firebrand. You know, Twitter wars, snappy comebacks, big earrings and bigger volume." "She wore no makeup," Diane said. "She wore a pin of her grandmother," Olivia added. Conrad's brow furrowed. "So what the hell do we do?" "Damage control," Brad said quickly. "Spin," Dan countered. "But subtle." "No," Olivia said firmly. "Anything we say will backfire. She's not trending because she won an argument. She's trending because people think we lost the right to question her." Conrad blinked. "Is that what this is about now? Rights?" "No," Dan said. "It's about recognition. She told the truth, and people could feel it." The screen behind them flickered as the clip restarted. Jasmine again. That stare, that stillness, that line. "The truth cannot be silenced." "People think we ambushed her," Olivia said softly. Conrad gestured vaguely. "Didn't we?" That question, unspoken until now, cut through the air like a blade. Dan didn't answer. He didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew what The View had become over the years. A comfortable machine built on chaos and control. They brought in conflict like seasoning, pre-measured and safely packaged. No one was ever truly destroyed. They were managed. Guests were either allowed to soften their image or set themselves on fire. Jasmine Crockett, however, had done neither. She had absorbed the setup and dismantled it from within. "I thought Whoopi was supposed to own that room," Max said quietly, instantly regretting it. "She usually does," Dan replied. "But she blinked," Olivia finished. They all remembered it. That half second when Whoopi looked down, eyes unfocused. A blink that lasted a heartbeat too long. A visible stumble from someone who never stumbled. The moment the room had shifted. And now, the audience wasn't talking about The View. They were talking about Jasmine. Outside the building, news vans had started circling, hoping for a statement. Inside, the emails kept piling in. Viewers who had been loyal to the show for years were sending something ABC hadn't expected. Not complaints, but questions. Why had Jasmine been treated like a disruption instead of a guest? Why hadn't the panel listened? And, most dangerous of all, why did she seem like the only honest person in the room? That last question repeated itself across Facebook threads and Reddit forums like a quiet rebellion. She didn't look like she was selling anything. She didn't try to be charming. She looked like she was standing in fire and didn't move. Every word built on the next, forming something no programming algorithm could predict. A groundswell. A memory. A shift. Conrad leaned back, suddenly tired. "Do we bring her back?" Dan almost laughed. "You think she'd come?" "No," Diane said. "But I think America just might follow her out the door." The silence returned. Only this time, it felt final. No decisions were made that day. No PR campaigns launched. No official statements released. Because deep down, everyone in that room knew what had happened, and worse, what couldn't be undone. They hadn't just platformed a guest, they had aired a mirror, and for the first time in a long time, people were looking. In a truck stop diner just outside of Topeka, Kansas, the clip played for the third time on an old mounted TV above the pie counter. The screen was cracked in the corner, and the closed captions struggled to keep up with the video. Still, no one spoke. No one touched their coffee. 3 men sat at the counter, one in a camouflage jacket that hadn't seen a deer in years, one in a Ford mechanic coverall, and one in an old veteran's baseball cap that had been restitched too many times to count. They weren't friends, not really. They just knew each other's names, sat in the same seats every week, and shared the same fatigue carved into their jawlines. But that morning, they were united by something far more rare than habit. Jasmine Crockett was on the screen, and they were listening. It was the moment again. That line. The truth cannot be silenced, no matter how many cameras you set or how many laughs you script. The mechanic leaned forward, elbows on Formica. She wasn't scared. The man in the camo nodded slowly, still watching the replay. She wasn't selling anything either. No one replied right away. They didn't need to. What they were witnessing wasn't normal, and they knew it. They'd watched 100 political interviews, most of them performative, smug, angry, empty. But this wasn't that. This was a woman standing in the belly of a media beast designed to mock and misrepresent her, and she didn't just survive. She held the damn line. "She reminds me of my old CO in '71, the vet said finally, voice low. "She didn't shout. She just gave you that look like, 'I'll walk into hell if I have to, but I'm not blinking.' That kind of look." Across America, scenes like this unfolded in places where political opinions had hardened like concrete decades ago. But Jasmine wasn't cracking the walls with ideology. She was whispering something more disruptive: conviction. In a worn-down Union Hall in Youngstown, Ohio, 7 retirees sat beneath a dusty American flag, watching the segment replay on YouTube. No talking heads, no analysis, just raw footage. "I hated that show," one of them muttered. "Still do." "Then why we watching it?" someone else asked. "'Cause she's not them," came the answer. In Arkansas, a high school janitor in his 60s pulled out a burner phone during break and replayed the moment for a younger teacher. "You want to know what courage looks like?" he asked. "This, right here." In Tennessee, in a barber shop that doubled as a debate club on Saturdays, 3 older black men and 2 white farmers from the edge of town found themselves nodding at the same timestamp. Jasmine staring dead into the camera, saying not a single extra word, just, "I'm not here for applause. I'm here because silence helps no one." That was the moment the applause track in their heads shut off. That was the moment they stopped seeing a Democrat or a black woman or a politician and started seeing something closer to what they had forgotten. Someone who had nothing left to prove, but still chose to speak. It wasn't a policy proposal that moved them. It was the posture, the stillness, the steel, the refusal to be edited. Most of these men had never voted the same way twice. Some had stopped voting altogether. They didn't wear slogans. They didn't share articles. They didn't comment on political posts. But that week, they did one thing they hadn't done in years. They hit replay, not once, not twice, but over and over. And with each replay, something subtle shifted. Not their entire worldview, not their party loyalty, but their ears. They were open. Their eyes, they were sharper. The cynicism that had calcified over the years, fed by broken promises and empty sound bites, didn't vanish, but it cracked. Just enough to let in a question: could she be real? In a dusty garage in rural Montana, 2 brothers who hadn't spoken since the 2020 election sat side by side for the first time in years, both watching Jasmine's segment separately on their phones until one said, "You seen this?" And the other replied, "Yeah, she ain't like the rest of them." And that was the thing. Jasmine Crockett wasn't asking them to like her. She wasn't even asking them to agree. She simply stood her ground, said what needed saying, and didn't flinch when the room turned hostile. That made her dangerous. Not to the men watching, but to the system they'd grown to resent. The usual weapons didn't work on her. She wasn't loud, so she couldn't be accused of yelling. She wasn't vague, so she couldn't be spun. She wasn't fragile, so pity had no place. And when Whoopi had launched the usual attacks, accusations of divisiveness, privilege, inexperience, Jasmine had met them with lived truth, not rehearsed rebuttals. That, to the men watching, was familiar. It was the same way their fathers used to talk when they came home from the factory. Quiet, direct, bone-tired of BS. "She ain't performing," one ex-coal miner from West Virginia wrote in a Facebook comment. "She testifying." And others echoed him. "She talks like someone who's been through it. She reminds me of the nurse who fought to keep my wife on a transplant list. She ain't trying to be liked. She's just not afraid of being hated." For a generation of men taught to grit their teeth and bury pain, Jasmine's stillness wasn't weakness. It was command. For decades, they'd been told to vote for anger, or for charm, or for fear. But now, they were watching someone speak with none of those masks. In a small coffee shop in Reno, a group of truckers rotated through their stops, and one guy left his phone on the counter. The clip autoplayed. The barista, a woman in her 50s, looked up at the screen, then turned to the counter. "She say that just like that?" The trucker nodded. Didn't blink once. Back at the diner in Kansas, the mechanic finally broke the silence again. "You think she'll run for president?" The vet chuckled. "I don't think they'd let her." "Then maybe it's time someone didn't ask for permission." The man in the camo coat sipped his coffee and stared back up at the screen, now paused on Jasmine's face. A still image, but somehow more alive than most speeches ever given. "She didn't ask to lead," he said. "Yeah," the vet muttered, finishing his cup, "but I'd follow her anyway." The first time it happened, it barely registered. A conservative morning radio show out of Des Moines opened its 6 a.m. segment with a quote they had never aired before. Not Reagan, not Trump, not some viral talking point from Turning Point USA. Just a voice, Jasmine's, clipped from her appearance on The View. "I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to look around and ask yourself who's profiting from the silence." There was no editorial, no snide remark, no canned laughter, just the quote, followed by 30 full seconds of dead air. In talk radio, silence is death. But here, it was respect. Callers lit up the board. Who was that? Was that the woman from The View? She didn't sound like a Democrat. She sounded like someone who's been lied to, same as the rest of us. By the time the host came back on, he didn't even need to comment. The audience was already processing what the producers hadn't expected. An instinctive, almost tribal recognition of truth. Not partisan truth, not the kind that fits neatly in a tweet. Something older, grittier, human. She talked like my sister used to before the pills took her, one caller said, like she remembered what struggle felt like. That moment was the start, but it wasn't the end. Within 48 hours, a libertarian podcast in Idaho opened with the same clip. Then a military veteran channel in Kentucky reposted it, calling her a public servant with grit. A populist farming collective in Nebraska added subtitles in Spanish and English and reposted it to their 75,000 followers, captioning it, "Real recognizes real." By the end of the week, one of the most unlikely endorsements came from a retired Tea Party strategist on a live YouTube stream. I don't care what side she's on. If she can walk into a studio like that, get ambushed, and leave with the room in her hand, that's a leader. Period. Mainstream political consultants were baffled. They ran the numbers over and over again. She hadn't changed policy positions. She hadn't softened her tone. She hadn't worn red, white, and blue on her sleeve. And yet her clip was performing better among independents and center-right audiences than it was among left-wing circles. Why? Because she didn't ask anyone to like her. She just stood still while everyone else flinched. And that kind of power doesn't belong to a party. It belongs to history. In Arizona, a former Border Patrol agent who'd voted Republican his entire life posted a screen recording of Jasmine's line. "If unity means silence in the face of injustice, then I'll walk alone." He didn't write a caption. Just let the video speak. It got 600,000 shares in 3 days. In Detroit, a group of auto workers stitched her words into a TikTok set against black and white footage of factory layoffs. The top comment read, "She didn't talk policy. She talked pain." And in Georgia, a small-town preacher read her quote aloud from the pulpit, without attribution. Only later did one of his parishioners tell him who said it. He paused, then nodded slowly. God doesn't check party registration before he anoints a truth-teller. That was the moment the narrative cracked. She wasn't being seen as one of theirs, or the opposition. She was being heard as one of us, a mirror, not a messenger, a reminder, not a reformer. And that terrified the media industrial complex more than any poll ever could. On MSNBC, anchors were split. Some hailed her as the next generation of progressive leadership. Others were more cautious. She didn't defend party policy, one analyst noted. She defended moral clarity. That's not always the same thing. At Fox News, the confusion was more visceral. Some talking heads called her manipulative. Others tried to paint her as part of the woke machine. But those narratives struggled, because the clip told its own story. No editing, no flashy graphics. Just Jasmine, unmoved, refusing to play victim, and refusing to be made a villain. Even in echo chambers designed to prevent perspective, cracks formed. Because when a voice resonates that deeply, it doesn't knock. It enters uninvited. In a small church in Alabama, a men's Bible study group met for their usual Friday circle. They'd spent years arguing over politics, often angrily, sometimes bitterly. But that week, someone brought a laptop, played the clip. The room was silent afterward. One man who'd never said much before finally murmured, "I don't agree with all she said, but I believed every word of it." Another nodded. "So did I, and I ain't believed a politician in 20 years. They didn't change party. They didn't switch teams. But they remembered what it felt like to believe something again. And that, more than any donation, endorsement, or tweet, was power. Real power. Jasmine herself said nothing during that week. She didn't thank her followers. She didn't quote tweet the praise. She didn't post filtered selfies or do Instagram lives explaining what it all meant. She stayed quiet, grounded, focused. When pressed by a local reporter outside her district office about the viral wave, she simply said, "I'm not flattered. I'm just glad people are listening." Listening, Not cheering, not agreeing, not weaponizing, just listening. Because Jasmine Crockett had done what no strategist could plan, what no media consultant could script, what no billionaire could buy. She had stepped into a place designed to erase her and left a burn mark that wouldn't fade. Not because she fought harder, but because she stood truer. And now across the country, people from every political direction were asking the same dangerous question. If she's telling the truth, what else have we not been hearing? In Washington, consultants panicked. Lobbyists recalculated. Party officials whispered her name not with admiration, but with caution. She was unpredictable. She was uncontrollable. And worst of all, she was believable. And for the first time in years, believability was crossing party lines like wildfire across dry grass. The headlines faded. The algorithms recalibrated. Other faces filled the screens. But something about Jasmine Crockett's appearance on The View refused to die. It lingered. Not as a clip or a meme or a talking point, but as a fracture. A quiet, spreading fracture in the polished veneer of media performance, political calculation, and cultural cynicism. Because Jasmine hadn't just disrupted a TV segment, she had broken a spell. The spell that told Americans they couldn't trust their own instincts, that only the loudest deserved the mic. That outrage was authenticity, that identity was agenda, that silence was strategy. She shattered all of that with a look, a line, and a stillness so grounded it unnerved even seasoned professionals. And as that stillness echoed beyond the studio walls, it began asking a different kind of question, not about who was right or wrong, but about who was willing to pay the cost of telling the truth. The lesson wasn't buried in a soundbite. It couldn't be. Because the people who needed to hear it most weren't scrolling for slogans. They were watching with crossed arms, tired eyes, and a lifetime of being let down. In her refusal to shout, Jasmine shouted something deeper. That dignity doesn't require permission. That courage isn't measured by applause. And that truth doesn't ask for a stage. It demands one. Across the country, people who never commented suddenly spoke. Fathers who had never cried suddenly said, "That part got me." Teachers shared the clip between classes. Mechanics texted it to their sons. Ministers quoted it on Sunday without ever saying her name. Not out of disrespect, but reverence. Because what she had done couldn't be reduced. It couldn't be spun. It was too real. And here was the realest part. Jasmine didn't walk into that studio to make a statement. She walked in because she had carried too many names. Names that would never make the news. Names that died behind bars, in evictions, in silence. She had walked through halls where bills were buried before the ink dried, where justice wore a tie and a grin, and where truth had to beg for airtime. She didn't want the spotlight, but she knew how to survive it. And what she delivered in that moment wasn't defiance, it was deliverance. A reminder that sometimes someone has to refuse to kneel to the choreography of a system designed to humiliate them. That was the lesson. You don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to win to be right. You don't have to be accepted to matter. Because power doesn't always come from popularity. Sometimes it comes from persistence, from presence, from pain, harnessed like steel, not to hurt others, but to hold ground that no one else will. And Jasmine held that ground with every syllable, every pause, every story she brought into a room built to erase them. They wanted her to play a part. She chose to write a different ending. And in doing so, she reminded us that authenticity is not a performance. It is a posture. In a world full of cameras, she made eye contact with the country and didn't flinch. She stared into the machine and made the machine blink. That's not politics. That's prophecy. And it's why, long after the media moved on, the echo remained. Because the truth, once seen, can't be unseen. It doesn't fade when the segment ends. It grows roots. And Jasmine's words had taken root in places the media rarely visits. In tired living rooms, on late-night commutes, in church basements and prison libraries and back porches where people still talk with conviction. She reached the kind of Americans who don't ask for change because they've learned not to expect it. But when they heard her speak, they sat up straighter. Because she wasn't just speaking to cameras. She was speaking for someone Someone who's been waiting years for a representative to say, "This is unjust, and I won't pretend otherwise." That was her rebellion. Not rage, not rhetoric, just honesty so clean it sliced. And that's what made her dangerous. Not to the people, but to the pretense. To the illusion that politics is only for the polished. That power is only for the proven. That dignity is something you earn after playing the game. Jasmine played no game. And yet she won the moment, not with aggression, with grace. And that grace, under fire, under scrutiny, under attack, wasn't just rare. It was unforgettable. So what's the lesson? The lesson is that truth still works, that conviction still lands, and that a single voice, unapologetic, uncoached, unbroken, can realign a conversation more than a million retweets. The lesson is that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, but stillness in the face of noise is power. Jasmine didn't need to convert everyone. She didn't need to trend. She needed only to remind the country there is still something worth believing in. There is still such a thing as earned trust. And there are still moments when a woman standing tall in hostile space can change everything. Not by fighting louder, but by refusing to bow. That is not just a story. That is a warning and a hope. Because if one woman can do that with nothing but her voice and her spine, what could 1,000 do? What could a nation do? The system may forget. The show may move on. But we remember. Not the debate, not the drama. The moment. The moment she said, "I don't carry my skin like a weapon. I carry it like a witness." And every man, woman, and child who has ever been silenced felt seen. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.